Okay, welcome to the first night of my Secrets of the Esoteric Tradition course. Some of you are new to the webinar format. I'm still trying to get used to it. It's a little strange talking into a machine, although I have a few people here tonight in the room, which helps a lot. That makes it more of an interactive type of environment. And the reason why I call it Secrets of the Esoteric Tradition is because over the years that I've studied with different teachers in different traditions, Tibetan, Kriya Yoga, Hindu, Sufi, and so on, Christian, I've gone to many, many lectures. And the funniest thing is that of all the things that I retain the most of all those talks, it's the personal anecdotes, it's the personal insights that people relate, the teachers say about their own lives, or things that I might have, as I got to know these teachers, things that they might have said in private over dinner or just walking down the street with them, for example, because I've had some close connections to various teachers. And what I want to do is try to piece those together for the sake of this class in terms of finding a way of making sense of these different oral teachings, because that's really what I want to focus on here, the oral teachings, things that you will not normally find in books, in published accounts about spirituality or mysticism or occultism. And it's almost like a jigsaw puzzle trying to fit this together in the form that we're going to have here over the next 6 weeks. And by the way, because it is a webinar format, even though this isn't interactive in terms of the microphone, you can always type in questions or comments if anything isn't clear or you want some kind of clarification. You can always type it into the box there, and the people in the room here can, of course, just let me know if they have a question. And the things, I want to cover a number of things over the course of these 6 weeks. I want to cover karma, reincarnation, near-death experiences, sex, sacred geometry, the chakras, subtle energies, the magical will, samadhi, the nature of God, the anatomy of the self, things like that. And tonight we're going to be covering the big picture of what's it all about. I normally do that at the end of these classes, and this time I'm doing it at the beginning, and I'll wrap it up at the end of the last class using the Garden of Eden as a metaphor this time. But I thought I'd begin by talking about the three primary teachers that I've studied with who really form the basis of what I've learned on these different subjects. So I'm going to scroll over here to the first teacher. There we go. Goswami Kriyananda is someone I first went to hear when I was 19. Excuse me. And he was teaching on State Street in downtown Chicago, and I wound up studying with him for about 15 years. He's a Chicago-born yogi. He started studying yoga and Kriya Yoga in his late teens with his teacher, who we'll talk about here in a minute. And even though I studied with him closely for about 15 years, I still keep in touch with him. He's in his 80s now. He lives in the south of France. And we still interact, we still communicate, though he's very busy. He has a lot of students. He teaches in France and comes here back to Chicago once or twice a year. And he had a very down-to-earth, he was a double Taurus. He had a very down-to-earth approach to spirituality and occultism. You know, if it's practical, that's what's important. But he also had an extraordinary mind for esoteric ideas, metaphysics, and astrology in particular, where I learned a lot from him about that. And his teacher was a fellow named Shelley Trimmer, a very mysterious teacher that originally lived up in Minnesota when Kriyananda studied with him and then wound up moving to Florida. But he had been a student of Yogananda's. This is the first picture here of Kriyananda I took around in 1983 or 84. And this is a picture I took of Shelley Trimmer in around 1978. I went down to his home, and I would often interact with him and talk with him about everything under the sun, actually. And a very profound mystic and occultist. We're going to talk about that distinction here in a little bit. He studied with Yogananda back, I think, probably around 1939 or 1940, and stayed with him for several years, I believe, out in Encinitas in Los Angeles at Yogananda's ashram, and was raised in the Pennsylvania Dutch tradition. Shelley was both a mystic and an occultist. He knew ceremonial magic. He had a hobby with quantum physics. Very brilliant man. He died in 1996, born in 1917. And probably the most profound thinker I've ever met. And a lot of what I'm talking about here tonight, in fact, is based on bits and pieces of things that I learned from him. And the last teacher I want to mention is Dido, John Dido Lurie. He was the teacher I studied with at Zen Mountain Monastery in upstate New York in the mid-'80s. And also, all three of these, in my opinion, are truly great teachers. And he died last year, the year before. And he was a former chemist and photographer and Navy man, had been in the Navy for 5 years and wound up becoming a Zen teacher, a very great Zen teacher, in my opinion, at the Zen Center up near Woodstock, New York. And he wasn't so much of a metaphysician or an occultist. You know, that's something they don't get into really in Zen, on the surface anyway. Maybe in private they do, but I learned a great deal from him as well. And so what I'm going to do in these classes is synthesize a lot of what I've learned from these teachers and other teachers. I studied with Chogyam Trungpa, Namkhai Norbu, Pir Vilayat Khan, and on it goes. And when I worked here in this building at the Theosophical Society, a lot of teachers came through. During the 10 years that I worked here, it was I couldn't even count how many really interesting teachers and writers came through to speak. Now, what I want to do tonight is open kind of with the big picture and what this is about, but I need to make a few kind of clarifications to start with, one of which is there's two very important terms that we're going to come back to. In particular, mysticism and occultism. What's the difference between the two? And the analogy that I used in The Waking Dream to talk about this was, a mystic is, if you think of reality as being like a Empire State Building, the mystic is the person that wants to get into the elevator and ride the elevator, the express elevator, to the penthouse or to the observation deck, you might say. They're not as concerned about what's on all the individual floors and the wiring of the building and the plumbing and, you know, what's on the first floor, what's on the third floor. They're interested in what's really up there. I'm generalizing, but, you know, I'm trying to make a point. And an occultist, though, is kind of interested in what is on all the floors, how the whole building works, the wiring of the building, the substructure, you know, what is the basement like, what's the foundation like? How do you get the lights to work? How do you get the plumbing to work? Et cetera, et cetera. It's a little more practical. Now, it's a bit of an artificial distinction because a lot of mystics are occultists and a lot of occultists are mystics. Like, for example, the classic archetype of that is Merlin. Merlin is a combination of a mystic and an occultist. Shelley and Kriyananda were both mystics and occultists. Especially Shelley, who had this extraordinary knowledge of magic and the occult at the same time that he was, you know, into God and mysticism and, you know, transcendence and all this. So that's one point. The other thing I want to what we're doing tonight is setting the table, you might say, for the rest of the 6 weeks. And another term that we're going to be coming up against a lot during this course is spirit and soul. What is the difference between spirit and soul? And in a very simple sort of way, you could say that spirit is the pure I am. It's the pure awareness. Shelley describes spirit as the I am aware that I am. And soul is a combination of the memories, the emotions, the astral kind of energies of the person. It's everything that, it's like the sheath of the spirit, you might say. It has a lot to do with emotions. Whereas spirit does not have to do with emotions. That's like a witnessing sort of factor. And those are 2 points that I think are really critical if you're trying to enter into this whole subject. All right, now like I said, I want to use the story of the Garden of Eden as a kind of mystical template here because it serves as a really useful framework for discussing fairly profound ideas. And there's the fundamentalist view of the Garden of Eden, and then you've got the esoteric and Gnostic view of the Garden of Eden, which is reading the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, and the apple and the serpent and the fall, as a kind of mystical parable of awakening. The way the fundamentalist looks at the Garden of Eden is more or less as a story of humankind's fall into sin and into ignorance and the death and decay and all this. Whereas to the mystic, the Garden of Eden, and to the Kabbalist, the Garden of Eden holds some very profound secrets, and it's hard to know at this point. In fact, it's impossible to know how much of the story of that deeper meaning of the garden was intended, how much of it was accidental, and how much of it is intuitive. Because a lot of times in mythologists, people create myths sometimes without knowing the full depth, because it's coming out of their collective unconscious part of their psyche. And it doesn't really matter, because I'm going to use it as this framework that I think will help explain some of these ideas that I think are pivotal in understanding this oral tradition. And I want to begin that process by relating a story, an anecdote. I hope to relate a lot of anecdotes in this course. An anecdote about Shelley. Shelley, when he was studying with Yogananda, Shelley was quite profoundly clairvoyant and psychic, and that's something I believe from personal experience. And Shelley was talking about the time that when he was studying with Yogananda, Yogananda would sit with his students and give talks or chant, and he would sit in meditation at the close of his talks. And this one time, Shelley was sitting with the group and watching Yogananda, and he said he saw Yogananda light up like a sun. And he could see this astrally, that this was going on, and nobody else saw it. So after a while, everybody else got kind of bored and walked out. But Shelley stayed there, and because he wanted to see, what was going on, and he wanted to talk with Yogananda afterwards. And so after quite a while, he said Yogananda was just, like a supernova, this energy. He said he could tell that he was in an extremely high state of consciousness, like God consciousness. So he waited until Yogananda kind of came to, so to speak. That's the wrong metaphor, but you get what I mean. And Yogananda opened his eyes, and Shelley went up to him, and maybe he shouldn't have done this. Maybe it was a little bit impertinent to, catch someone at that moment, but he knew that this is the time to ask him the questions. So he said to Yogananda, "Were you in God consciousness just now?" And Yogananda very gently said yes. And he pressed him and he says, "Were you absolutely at one with God?" And Yogananda said, "Yes, I was absolutely one with God." So then Shelley hit him with the big question. He said, "What happened, Yogananda, when you were one with God?" It's a very profound question. And Yogananda gave a very profound answer. He said, "When I was totally at one with God, Mukunda was still Mukunda." Mukunda was Yogananda's, not maiden name, but you know what I mean, before he became a yogi. Mukunda was his childhood name. And so he was implying that his individuality did not get dissolved in that immersion into the cosmic ocean, so to speak. And that's a very critical point, because it's not talked about in the esoteric field too often, but there's this fundamental question that it's an important question. Are we truly individuals, or are we just, like Ram Dass used to say, behind this great drama, there's only one of us, okay? And there are two, not opposing, but two different camps in India. There's the Vedanta camp, which says we're all one. It's all oneness, non-duality. And there's another camp, which is Samkhya. Sometimes it's called Shankhya, which is called dualistic, and I think that's a little bit misleading. And sometimes it's talked about, well, it's dualistic because it believes in two fundamental things, Prakriti and Purusha. But it's also dualistic in that it believes in individuals, and that we're individual divinities, you might say, individual atmas, and that we aren't simply all just one being behind this. That doesn't mean there isn't unity, but there is individual distinction. And one of the reasons that's an important point is that it makes a difference in how you interpret certain religious scriptures and certain myths, like the Garden of Eden. Because if you take the Vedanta view for the Garden of Eden, it comes up with this idea that God created us, out of the dust of the earth and all that. The Sankhya view, the Samkhya view, is very different. It basically says that God is one of us, like that song from the 90s, that we are all individual gods, you might say. We're all sparks of that divinity, and that we weren't created by God, so to speak. God is another being like us who happened to attain this extraordinary state of cosmic consciousness. And I'm throwing out some weird ideas, I know, for some people that may not be familiar with these thoughts, but bear with me. I don't ask anyone to believe these things, just accept it maybe as an alternative mythology for the time being. But the term that Shelley used in talking about us is, he said, each of us sentient beings is a self-existent one. That's the term he used, self-existent one. That we've been around forever, we're going to be around forever. And Blavatsky, by the way, I came across a line in one of her books recently where she more or less said the same thing, where someone was questioning her about, does our individuality just dissolve in the great ocean? And she was implying, no, the individuality is yours. There's a sense in which you keep your individuality, not your personality. There's a difference there between the two. It's a subtle difference, but it's an important one. And it's a notion of divinity. It's a notion of God that is very Aquarian in terms of God as a brother or a sister, not a father figure. It's almost like we're entering into a different age where we're co-creators. We're on a par with God, so to speak, as this being. And I'm not getting to all the hair-splitting philosophically about God and transcendent versus immanent and all this. That's for another time maybe. But for right now, the point I want to get across is this idea that we're all gods. If there's any one point in esotericism that is a fundamental teaching of esotericism, it's that saying, ye are gods. It's that idea that you have that extraordinary godlike potential. Everybody does. And that, again, God happens to be this being. In the Garden of Eden, in the story of Genesis, rather, God is that being that created this extraordinary creation, emanated this effulgence out of his being. A better phrase that Yogananda and Shelley used, I think, is not so much creation, but a cosmic dream. All sentient beings dream. All sentient beings create this phantasmagorical, expression of their nature. Your dream reflects who you are, you might say. And that God created this cosmic dream, a multi-level dream that precipitated down, you might say, different levels to all the way to the condensation and the physical. In fact, I'm going to draw this out here. Could we switch to the pad there, Jim? So you might even talk about it like this. And this is a crude drawing, but hopefully it'll get the point across. Let's just say that's, the divine being. Plotinus referred to it as the One. The Hindus refer to it as Brahma, you might say. And this is the pure awareness principle there. In Kabbalah, it would be Keter, the top Sephiroth, and there's points beyond that, and that's a whole other thing. But it precipitates down in different levels, and that's all what the Neoplatonists would call the anima mundi. This whole thing there, from the spirit on down, that's God's soul, so to speak, and this is down here, matter, the physical plane. And up here is the mind factor. That's pure mind. N-O-U-S is the way the Neoplatonists talk about it. And so this is God's soul, you might say. This is God's spirit, the I am principle, and this is the feminine Shekinah, Sophia, you might say, the feminine principle of God. And it's an emanation out of that divine awareness, that I am, that cosmic I am aware that I am, or as Moses goes to the mountaintop and he asks God's name, and it's I am aware that I am that I am. And we're drawn into this. Actually, we can go back to the Garden of Eden now, go back to the image, and I'll click over to the next one. It's a nice painting. So, what is the Garden of Eden? The Garden of Eden is the higher planes of that creation, of God's soul, shall we say. In fact, sorry, Jim, but let's go back to the drawing just for a second so I can show this. the higher levels up here, there's all these higher levels that are like the bliss levels, the angelic, the heavenly points. Down here you get into the more material, physical plane. But up here we've got these archetypal levels, the levels of God's higher mind, you might say. And like moths to flame, to use a somewhat problematic metaphor, we're drawn, our natural home, Shelley said, is deep space. Our natural abode as Atmas is deep space, or rather, deep space is the closest thing to what we can understand of that, world, shall we say. And in the beginning was chaos, so to speak. The beginning point was not balance, and this creation brought order out of chaos, shall we say. And I'm simplifying an extraordinarily complex doctrine here, I hope you understand. And so we're drawn into this dream. There's this being that has created this extraordinary dream, and we're drawn into it because of the harmony, the beauty, the spirituality, the bliss. And we enter into that, and just by being a part of that dream, we're lifted up. I heard Orson Welles, an interview with the actor Orson Welles, and he was very self-effacing, and he talked about one of the reasons that he liked to play in Shakespeare was just playing in Shakespeare's plays lifted him up. There was such a nobility and such a brilliance and beauty to these plays that simply acting in these plays lifted his energy. My terms, not his. And in a sense, that's what draws the Atmas into this cosmic dream, shall we say. The sense of the energy, the vibe. It's almost like actors in New York. They hear of a great play and they want to be a part of it, and so you're drawn to it, and that's how the entities are drawn into this cosmic dream. But we were not, I'm getting back to this point, we were not created by that God. God created the forms that we've taken on. And what I mean by that is, think of Laurence Olivier playing Hamlet. Shakespeare did not create Laurence Olivier. Shakespeare did not create John Gielgud or Orson Welles. He created the characters, shall we say. And there's a whole aspect to this story having to do with creating us in his image, which we're going to talk about next week in terms of what does that mean from an esoteric standpoint, on the five-pointed star and all this. So we're drawn into this dream, and several things happen. There's two critical developments that happen when we're in this dream, this cosmic dream in the garden, shall we say. One is that we lose ourselves. We kind of get caught up in it. We're entranced by the forms, by the beauty, by the extraordinary, phantasmagorical sort of creations, and we lose ourselves in it. And let me go ahead to the next image there, Jim. It's similar to the method Narcissus, where we gaze into this dream, and we're actually looking at ourselves in a way, the reflection of ourselves. We fall into the pond, so to speak. We forget who we are. We forget that we're just sightseers, shall we say. And if you've ever seen the movie Pleasantville, which is a really profound film with who played Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire and Reese Witherspoon. It's a profound film. If you haven't seen it, see it. If you have seen it already, look at it again from this standpoint, because it deals a lot with this mythology on different levels. It's not just about conservative versus liberal. And it deals with these two teenagers that are sucked into a black and white TV story, like a Mayberry with the Andy Griffith Show. They're sucked into it. And the same thing in the movie Tron, the first movie Tron, where the Jeff Bridges character, is playing a video game and he's sucked into the game. In a sense, that's what happens. We're sucked into the game and we forget that we're just in a game. We start taking it personally. We start identifying with the video characters that we're playing with the Xbox or whatever it is they use. I've never played Xbox, so I think there's characters in Xbox, isn't there? Where you identify with something. But anyway, or like imagine you're going through Disneyland and you get caught up in the marvels of Disneyland, but you forget that it's just an amusement park and you start living there. In a sense, that's kind of what happens in this fantastic creation that we've entered into. We weren't created as part of it. our forms were maybe, but not our basic spirits. And the way Shelley used to put it was, he said that we get lost in the maze of self. We'll come back to that in a later week, but it's an important concept. And the other key thing that happens, which is basically related, it's a little different, is the fall. What is the fall in the Garden of Eden? What does it mean? You know, that sense of falling. They eat of the apple from the tree of good and evil. And is it a fall in the sense of a fall into sin? Or is it really like the Gnostics would say and the mystics would say, a fall from innocence? Now what I mean by that is this. Now I think the next image here, if I'm right, yeah. Think of a child growing up at home, being taken care of by the parents, being fed, being told what to do. The child is obedient. And there comes a point in almost every child's life when they start to develop a certain independent mind. And they start thinking for themselves, and that often manifests as a disobedience. And it's a natural process. It can happen anywhere from, I guess 5 to 25 years old, but it's an awakening out of the programming of your parents, so to speak. It's developing autonomy. It's a sense of becoming, well, not only independent, but there's a sense of self-determination. And at that point, it's like a breaking free. It may manifest as leaving home. That's why I put this picture up there. But it doesn't have to manifest as a physical leaving home, because some people never leave home and they have that independence, and other people leave home and they never have that independence. And that's an analogy, I'd say, for what happens in terms of our growth within the cosmic dream, according to what Shelley and Yogananda implied. In other words, there's a point when you're in the garden, so to speak, you're running on God's programs, God's software, maybe even God's hardware, so to speak. And you're acting out of the programming. You're not really acting independently. You're not truly acting out of your own volition. And there comes a point when you start waking up, so to speak, when you start realizing that there's something more than just the programs, that you're not just there to be taken care of. And Carl Jung had a line. He said, "There is no morality without freedom." You might paraphrase that. There is no morality without choice, with free will. In other words, you can't really say someone is good or bad if they're not acting out of their own volition. Why is it our laws, we have different laws for minors than we do for adults? If a 5-year-old, well, that's a little ludicrous, but let's say a 12-year-old robs a bank, I suppose it's possible. They're not going to convict that child the same way they would a 25-year-old, because they assume they don't really have the mind to choose. They're just acting on their programming, so to speak. You really can't be called good or evil until you're acting independently. Like, you can't call a dog evil or good. You can say they're naturally good. You can say they're naturally bad, so to speak, but you can't say that they're intentionally good or bad, and there's a big difference there between the two. And in a sense, that's what happens when you wake up in the garden. That's what the fall from the garden is like, in a sense, where you wake up to good and evil in terms of now you can act intentionally. Now you can really make decisions out of your own volition. It's a profound difference. It's a profound shift. And it's almost, and I mean this just as a kind of a half-serious analogy, but imagine you're Jehovah and you've got these 2 kids in your gardens, shall we say, Adam and Eve, and you've been taking care of them and guiding them along, and they're kind of resting on your laurels, so to speak. They're enjoying the bliss, the fruits of your dream, but you want them to grow up at some point. You want them to realize the fruits of autonomy, to realize the fruits of their own divinity. But you can't coerce them to make that leap. You've got to somehow find a way to make it so that they make the choice themselves. So what do? You say, don't touch that apple. You can have anything in this garden that you want, but don't touch that apple. Whatever you do, what more surefire way you come up with to make sure that they do go to the apple? And it would be an act of willful self-volition. It would not be something they were programmed to do. And with that action, that's a profoundly important sort of action, because that sets the entire new life into motion in terms of an entirely new existence of autonomy and independence and of awakening. Now, what is the agent of change in the story? It's a serpent. What happened there? Did we lose the... There we go. It's a serpent. Now, you'll notice what that looks like there if you're into yoga. But what does the serpent symbolize? Is it, like the fundamentalists say, a symbol of Satan? Is the serpent a symbol of demonic forces, of something negative? Or is it somehow a symbol of your own awakening? Is it a symbol of God even? Could it even be a good cop, bad cop situation? Both Jehovah and the serpent are two different aspects of the same divinity, kind of playing good cop, bad cop. Or is it a symbol, you might say, in New Testament symbolism, of the Christ principle inside you? Now let's go to the next image and I'll explain what I'm talking about there. There's in the Old Testament, there's a quote in Numbers 21:9, and Moses made a snake of copper and put it upon a pole. And it came to pass that if a snake had bitten any man, when he beheld the snake of brass, he lived. Then in the New Testament, just as Moses lifted up the snake in the desert, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life. And let me go to this next image. Here's an artist rendering of the Old Testament story of a serpent on a cross. And then here's another image that's more New Testament related of a serpent on a cross. There is this very mysterious identification in the Bible, in Christian mysticism, between the serpent and Jesus. And in a sense, you could talk about it from a yogic standpoint. The serpent is a symbol of your own inner spirituality, you might say, that inner divine nature, the Christ principle inside of you. And let's go back to the drawing pad here, Jim. And needless to say, you know, in the yoga tradition we're going to be talking a lot about this next week. You have the serpents around the caduceus, around the staff, which represents Ida, Pingali, and Sushumna. And, you know, these three channels, the spiritual channel, the emotional channel, and the rational channel, spiritual life, dream life, waking life, and so on and so forth. So the serpent, in a sense, tempting Adam and Eve from a Gnostic esoteric standpoint, is really the inner awakening, the awakening of that inner spiritual principle. And I think there's even a line in the New Testament, something might be Paul, that says, "Be ye wise as serpents." You know, that sense of how is it the serpents can be called wise. And by the way, if anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in. You can type them up there if you want. So, going back to the drawing here, let's say that's the creation, so to speak. That's the divinity there, the one, Keter, the Godhead, so to speak. And you've got these levels. And so with that decision, we're up here somewhere in the higher levels, and with that decision, that self-determination, we begin the process of self-responsibility. We begin the process of karma, because now we're responsible in the same way that when you, technically speaking, become 18, now you're responsible for your actions. In the eyes of the law, you're no longer kind of given a free pass on mistakes. And so you are now setting into motion action. You're setting into motion different sorts of consequences, shall we say. And what does the Bible say happens to Adam and Eve? They behold their nakedness and they put on clothes. Now what does that mean? They put on bodies. They kind of fall down. So in other words, there's this process of descending, devolving, so-called devolving down, taking on bodies. And also, what is the apple? We've referred to, it's a curious synchronicity that they refer to it as Adam's apple. Adam's apple is this. That's the throat chakra. That's the Vishuddha chakra. That's the chakra that has to do with mind. And with the notion of good and evil, the sense of once you have a mind, once you have your own autonomy, you can be responsible for so-called good actions, so-called bad actions. So it's a whole new parameter that enters in there. Let me see what Steve wrote here. So in a sense, the fall had to happen for us to be truly human. Yes, that's a very good way to put it. We're going to come back to that in just a little bit. That's a very incisive way to put it. And, you know, there's a saying in Latin that comes from St. Augustine, O felix culpa. Does anybody know what O felix culpa means? It means basically, oh happy fault. Or another translation, it means fortunate fall. Fortunate fall. It's a part of the Mass, I believe. I'm not Catholic, but this idea that there is something about the fall that is important. It's a part of the process of the awakening, and though the Catholics, I think, interpret it a little bit different. We don't have time for that right now, but it's an important line. You can look that up. So there's this fall that happens, so to speak, and thus begins the round of rebirth, the round of karma, the process of billions of years. You know, I remember as a kid reading Edgar Cayce talking about how people had maybe 10 or 20 lives, and the points that Kriya and Shelley made over and over again was the fact that we've had thousands of lives, possibly millions of lives. We've been here a long time. Yes, a long time. And not just on Earth, probably. I mean, there's, you know, different teachings that we've been in different solar systems. We've been on different planes. Again, you don't have to believe that. I'm just saying that's the teaching that I've heard, the oral teaching. And that fall is very difficult in terms of, with the awakening of consciousness comes suffering. With the awakening of consciousness comes the pain of decay and growth and death and rebirth and all this sort of thing. And the Bible even hints at that, but also comes a whole new awakening to the richness of life. In the movie Pleasantville, when they start eating to the apple, so to speak, and there's even Genesis symbolism in that movie, which is uncanny. It goes from black and white to color. And in a sense, that's what happens. When this process starts, there's suffering that comes in, but also this extraordinary richness, because now you're taking charge. You become as gods, to use the Bible sense. You've awakened it to your godlike nature. It's not that you become as gods, you awaken to your godlike nature, so to speak. Kriya once made the comment that when someone asked him, what's the point of all this hardship? And he says, you only grow through resistance. You only grow through friction. And there's a saying that I came across recently, a smooth sea does not a skilled mariner make. You know, that sense of growing, that sense of developing your talents, developing your consciousness. And there's a snowball effect that happens with karma. It's a domino effect, because once you start the process of karma, it kind of builds, and you build more karma, and you build more karma from that karma. And so it can take just a few 100 billion years, I suppose, to kind of work through it all, however long it takes. You hear a phrase, old soul. What does old soul mean? From a Vedantic non-dual standpoint, it's kind of a meaningless statement, because unless you want to say that God created different souls at different times, which I don't buy, old soul takes on a whole different meaning when you come in from the Samkhya viewpoint. That different soul, old soul merely means really someone who has maybe been in this cosmic dream longer than others. There is no such thing as an old or a young soul. Well, actually, there is no such thing as an old or a young spirit. But there is old or young souls, so to speak, because the soul is the memory track. The soul is the kind of astral body and the emotions. So you can have an age factor there, I suppose. But a person might be new to this particular world and be a new soul in this world, but they might have been the oldest soul in their last world. You know, and Kriya made a joke about that once, where the highest soul in one world can go to another world and be considered like the lowest of the low, because they're just starting at the beginning of the ladder. So old may be relative to a given, you know, plane or a given world, so to speak. And a couple quick points about karma here. Maybe I should wait with those till next week, because I've got some very important things I want to cover here before we go. I'm going to skip ahead and we can finish up the other points here. Let's go back to the images, Jim, and I will pick that up next week. I have some interesting things about reincarnation that I want to go into here. What are these pictures, people are wondering. Okay, now, you'll see next week if you tune in. I hope you do. Anyway, I want to talk about an extraordinary Gnostic story that's been around for a long time because it was part of the apocryphal Acts of Thomas, and people didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it because it was apocryphal, but mystics recognized it for what it was. I want to read this for you here. Do we now switch to, this is the longer text, Jim. Can we switch to, this is an extraordinary story, and I'm giving you an abridged version here because the original is too long. This is off of Wikipedia here. But it's a fairly good translation from what I understand of the different scholars that have looked at it. When I was a little child and dwelling in my kingdom of my father's house, and in the riches and luxuries of my teachers, I was living at ease. Then from our home in the east, after they had made preparations, my parents sent me forth. Then they made with me an agreement, and they inscribed it in my heart so that it would not be forgotten. If you would go down into Egypt and bring back the one pearl which is in the middle of the sea surrounded by the hissing serpent, then you will put on your glorious garment, and your toga which rests is laid over it. And with your brother, our second in command, you will be heir in our kingdom. I went straight to the serpent. Did I skip? Go back a little bit. I want to make sure. Yeah, that's right. Thank you. I went straight to the serpent. Around its lodging I settled until it was going to slumber and sleep, that I might snatch my pearl from it. Then I became single and alone to my fellow lodgers. I became a stranger. But in some way or another they perceived that I was not of their country. So they mingled their deceit with me, and they made me eat of their food, shades of Persephone. I forgot that I was a son of kings, and I served their king, and I forgot the pearl, an account of which my parents had sent me. Because of the burden of their exhortations, I fell into a deep sleep. But because of all these things which happened to me, my parents perceived my oppression and were grieved for me. And they wrote a letter to me, and every noble signed his name on it. From your father, the King of Kings, and your mother, the governor of the East, and from your brother, our second in command, to you, our son, who is in Egypt, peace. Awake and arise from your sleep and hear the words of our letter. Remember that you are a son of kings. Consider the slavery you are serving. Remember the pearl, on account of which you were sent to Egypt. Think of your glorious garment. Remember your splendid toga, which you will put on and wear when your name is called out from the book of the combatants, athletes. And with your brother, our viceroy, with him you will be in our kingdom. I remembered that I was a son of kings, and my free soul longed for its natural state. I remembered the pearl, on account of which I was sent to Egypt. I underlined this part. Then I began charming it, the formidable and hissing serpent. I caused it to slumber and to fall asleep. For my father's name I named over it, and the name of our second in command, our double, and of my mother, the queen of the East. Then I snatched away the pearl, and I turned to go back to my father's house. And their filthy and unclean clothing I stripped off and left it in their country. And my glorious garment which I had stripped off, and my toga which was wrapped with it, from the heights of Hyrcania, however that is. My parents sent it there, with the hand of their stewards, who on account of their faithfulness could be trusted with it. I clothed myself with it and ascended to the palace of peace and worship. I bowed my head and worshipped him, the brightness of my Father who sent it to me. Because I had done his commandments, so also he did what he had promised. And in the palace of his scribes I mingled with his teachers, because he rejoiced in me and received me. And I was with him and in his kingdom, and with the voice of praise, and all his servants were praising him. That's okay. We're praising him. And he also promised that to the palace of the King of Kings I will hasten with him, and with my offering and with my pearl I should appear with him before our king. It's a really profound story. We don't have time to go into the whole thing, but the gist of it is basically a complement to the story of the fall. in terms of it talks about a fall and a return. But the key here is the pearl. What is the pearl? Do you have any thoughts about that? Anybody? Okay, while you're thinking about it, notice there's a forgetfulness. He eats of the food of the realm, so to speak. That's something you find in various mystical accounts of how he got trapped in this, amusement park, shall we say. You go into Disneyland, you start eating the food, and you become laden with that vibration of that realm, so to speak. But the pearl, I would say it's one of two things, and maybe the same thing. In a sense, it's the polished soul. In a sense, it is what the soul experiences through the process of this round of incarnation of the fall and the rise. And another way to think of it is the pearl is the cultivation of a principle of compassion. It's the feminine principle. The solar principle, that God principle, the witness, you might say, that's not compassion. That's more or less pure witnessing awareness. There is one of the things that is gained through entering into the creation, into the dream, which I prefer the term, is there's suffering that occurs, but through that suffering and through that beauty, there's an awakening of the heart energy. There's an awakening of compassion. There's an awakening of beauty. That is the pearl, you might say. How is a pearl formed? It's formed, traditionally they talk about a grain of sand, something that's rough, and then calcium carbonate and other chemicals kind of form over it as a protection. It's an immunological response on the part of the clam. But it's something rough that turns into something beautiful. Or it can be any irritant that is inside the clam. It doesn't have to be a grain of sand. But it's that process of, it's in a sense a metaphor for what happens as we descend down into the different levels, where we become more like that pearl. Let me go to the next image here to kind of convey something. In a sense, it's the divine feminine. It's the feminine is, like I said, the soul of God is the creation. It's the dream. And that's where the compassion is, that's where the suffering is, the feminine principle. And in entering into that realm, you develop this heart. What is it around, in the traditional Catholic representations of Mary, what is around her heart? Does anybody know? It looks like barbed wire practically. It's the thorns. There's a sense in which it's almost like that heart grows out of the suffering. I don't know if that's the intention of the artist, because I wasn't raised in that tradition, but in a sense, I think that's really what it's saying to some extent. It's not just Mary, it's Kuan Yin, it's any of the feminine principles, and it's not just the passive feminine principles. It's also, we go back here now to the, the next image here. Well, I'm going to go back. We're not quite there yet. It's, what is the serpent? What is the dragon? In a sense, the serpent and the dragon are the same thing as the pearl. In a sense, the serpent is the Shakti. The serpent is the emotional energy. The one thing that the feminine aspect of God, of the one, embodies is emotion in its good or its bad quality. And the reason why you have to put the serpent to sleep, or St. George has to slay the dragon to rescue the feminine and all this, is because you have to master the Shakti. If you don't master the Shakti, it will destroy you. If you don't master the emotions, you will be destroyed by the emotions. Once you master them, you can use them for acts of compassion, or you can be like Kali or Athena in positive ways. But that's the purpose of mastering that energy. Has anybody seen the movie The Hobbit? It's one of the interesting things about the movie is it's about the whole point of this newest, the Desolation of Smaug is the newest segment of the movie. You have this hobbit that the heroic journey of the movie is he's got to go capture this Arkenstone, this very precious stone that is guarded over by a dragon. It's the same symbolism. And it's sleeping, and he's got to find a way of dealing with this dragon in order to get this sacred stone out. It's the same idea, that the stone and the dragon, the pearl and the serpent, they are the same thing in a certain sort of very mystical sense. You find the same thing, a similar idea in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh is told that he has to dive down into the waters in order to get this sacred plant that bestows eternal life. Diving down, there's a gift, although he fails in the story, there is a gift that is gained by descending into the realm. And that's conveyed in an esoteric Kabbalistic sense in this next story, the Prodigal Son. I studied years ago with this Kabbalistic teacher who talked about, there's esoteric ways of reading every story in the Old Testament. And so, for example, Isaac and Abraham, the killing of Isaac isn't really about killing the son, that's about killing the lower ego. And once you're willing to do it, you don't really have to do it. That's the interesting thing. It's not really about infanticide. It's really about, a very profound spiritual process. And likewise, the prodigal son, there's something about the child that goes out and then comes back in. There's something that's gained in the rediscovery of the divinity, so to speak, the going out and the coming back. And that's what the pearl is about. It's about going down into Egypt, which is a symbol for, you might say that there's the physical plane for illusion in another sense. And then you come back out of it, you reconnect with the divinity, with the Godhead, so to speak, and now you've got something added. Think of it this way. Imagine, and I mean this just as an example, imagine you're up in heaven and you see two angels, and they're eternal angels, they've been around forever. And the one angel has only been up in the high heavens his entire existence for, let's say, 20 billion, trillion, zillion years. But the other angel next to him, her, has spent maybe 1 billion years down on the earth plane, going through the round of rebirth, having gone through life, death, having children, having to deal with suffering, having to help, having to deal with nature and all of its good and bad forces. What would be the difference between those two angels in terms of, there's a substantive difference between those two beings. And I would say that it has to do with soul. The one is big of soul, you might say. The angel that has been through all the round of rebirths and thousands of lifetimes and of the suffering and all that. There's also an element of compassion, I think. I would go so far as to say, if we go back to that previous image, there would be more of this, of that heart principle that would not be there in the angel that had been detached. And you hear these stories from occultists that claim they've gone up into the astral and talked to angelic beings who have never been down on the earth plane or never been in any incarnations. And they talk about how these beings can be very detached. They don't necessarily understand the suffering of humans. Now, I don't know if that's true or not because I haven't done it, but it's an interesting idea, and I've heard that more than a few times. Now, another example, the Dune series and the Dune movies have been made several times. You have this archetypal image of the character has to master the desert worms. He's got to ride on the back of these worms and master them. It's very similar to the Shakti principle, mastering the Shakti, mastering the Kundalini, you might say. And once that happens, there's like the marriage of the sun and the moon. There's this quality of, you've brought together both the best of the feminine, the best of the masculine. You've brought them together into some sort of, synthesis, alchemical marriage. Another thing, too, by the way, is the way I phrase this. I was talking with an astrologer friend of mine, Lawrence, recently, and I was saying how one of the advantages, well, I'll back up, I'll say this a little differently. Up on the higher planes, you can learn the lessons of fire and air. But on the earth plane, you can learn the lessons of fire, air, earth, and water. Earth is materiality, water is emotions, fire is it's almost like a pure awareness, spiritual energy principle, and air is intellect. You have the ability on the earth plane of mastering all four of those. You cannot, on the higher levels in the Garden of Eden, so to speak, learn the lessons of water and earth, if you understand what I mean by that symbolism. And you see a similar thing, too, in that kind of parallel storyline in the Iliad and the Odyssey. In the Iliad, you have Odysseus going out to Troy, and the Odyssey is his return to the feminine principle, having to come home. Now, any questions? We have to wrap this up in a few minutes here. I have a couple more points I want to make, but are there any other comments or questions if you want to jump in before we wrap up? Okay, let me read this final poem. This is Shelley's writing. Shelley has never wrote anything. I once asked him, never wrote anything except this. I once asked him why he never wrote any books, and he said, my students are my books. But a friend of mine happened to find this kind of semi-poem that he wrote. He claims he found it on the floor of his workshop, Shelley's workshop, so it's something he just spun out, but it's very profound, very Kabbalistic. It's very similar in the language. Even though Shelley was an ordained yogi, he was almost more of a Kabbalist than he was a yogi. And the phrasing on here is very similar to the Book of Concealed Mystery that the Theosophist and Golden Dawn figure MacGregor Mathers wrote. And I'm going to read this, and we're going to come back to this in the last class because I want to dissect it a little bit more in terms of what he's saying, and it kind of summarizes what I've been going over in this class. Before the beginning, chaos reigned in the infinities. Countenance beheld not countenance in balanced equilibrium. Countenance is awareness, a beholding itself. Creation followed creation in unsustained furies, until one brother held forth the vestments of honor. In his essence, the maze of self was solved. In him, countenance beheld countenance in balanced glory. Bliss flowed forth in undulating waves of joy. The sustained spiral of creation hewed forth into being. The brothers flocked to pay homage and obeisance before the Master. The wave of bliss spread unto all, willing that they might sup upon the crystalline dew. They descended into him and moved about the pathways to behold the law of the maze. Brother communicated unto brother the golden essence of truth. Countenance beheld countenance in the splendored visage of balance. Brothers became lost in the maze. Others descended to lend aid. And the sustained creation was maintained in balance against the folly of the fallen brothers. Yeah, and you could really write a whole book based on this passage in terms of taking every line and talking about the Kabbalistic and esoteric significance of it. But I think that you get a feel for what it's saying, even if you don't know all the terms like countenance and crystalline dew and all that. But we will come back to that at a later point. Now, in terms of next week, we're going to be talking about, let me give you a taste visually of that. We're going to be talking about the microcosm and the macrocosm. This is an extraordinary painting by the late Dutch artist Joffre. We'll talk about this amongst many other things and what this means, and the chakras and the subtle body and the microcosm principle and how we have an internal solar system. And those of you that just tuned in tonight, if you don't come back next time, I hope you do, but if you don't, thanks for coming. I really appreciate your attendance. And if there are any questions, we have one more minute here. If you have anything you want to add before we have to wrap this up. Anything that needs clarifying? Okay, I want to thank you for coming, and I hope to see you next week. Namaste.